All right, I want to welcome each one of you to turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Numbers. I ask that you turn with me to Numbers chapter 22. Now, if you didn't bring your own Bibles along, there's Bibles in the chairs around you. If you find one of those Bibles, the passage we're going to be looking at is found on page 112. And if this is your first time here, let me just orient you to what we're doing as a church. About 3 months ago, we decided to make a commitment together that we as a church are going to be reading through the Bible. And what I mean by that is not that we're going to do it here on Sundays, but we're really encouraging each one of us to just be reading God's Word for ourselves. And the idea is this, that it's probably not enough to just come on Sundays and let what happens here on Sundays be the main way in which we get to know God. But God is actually, He's communicated to us through this book. And it'd be a shame if you have a Bible sitting at home that you never opened up. And we really encourage, because it's one of the things that leads to the most spiritual growth, is that you just take this Bible and open it up and read along. And so what we're doing is we're just we started on one cover, we're going to try to read through the other. We started in Genesis, we read through that, and then Exodus and Leviticus, and now we're in the book of Numbers. We're going to start beginning next week into the book of Deuteronomy. So we just want to encourage you to be reading along with us and keeping pace. And then what we're doing on Sundays is we're gathering back together after everyone's been reading this together, and just, if you will, try to see the forest through the trees. Because the truth is, sometimes when you're reading through the Bible, there's a lot that's confusing there, and so it's helpful to get some orientation to what it is we're reading and what it's all about. So we're going to start today in chapter 22, and we're going to look at 3 chapters, 22, 23, and 24. There's really a remarkable, interesting, fascinating story here that I think is just so important. And I guess in order to give some orientation to what it is we're about to read, I'd like to put a verse from the book of Ephesians up on the screen. And I'd like for you to just consider this, because I think it's going to help orient us to what it is we're about to read here. This is that book. It's from the Apostle Paul in the book of Ephesians. He says this. He says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but," he says, "against rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." And what I'd like to do is I'd like to draw your attention to 2 of the first 3 words in this verse. These 2 words, our struggle. And probably when I say those 2 words out loud, our struggle, I don't have to convince anyone here that in this life there is struggle. My guess is that if we went around the room and I just held a microphone out, I could go to each and every single one of us, and you could talk about the struggle that you're engaged in right now. There's hardly any part of life that is not touched with trouble, frustration, difficulty. Whether we go to work or we go to school, or we're in relationships where there's frustrations and difficulties, or whether we're trying to accomplish something collectively in the public realm, or whether you look at politics, or whether you look at just about any human endeavor, I don't think I have to convince you that there is a struggle. In fact, one of the things that I reflect upon is that even, at least in my experience, the very best things in life are full of heartache, pain, and difficulty. I'll just use myself as an example. One of the greatest blessings that I have in my life, and I tell this to anyone, is that I'm a father of 3 beautiful young girls. And that's one of the best things I have in life. And yet, any of you who are parents, you know this, there is a struggle in parenting. From the moment my first daughter was born and I started losing sleep, through the terrible 2s and 3s and on up, and I don't even have teenagers yet. So I know there's a struggle coming, and those of you who even have adult children, you know that the struggle doesn't end when they leave home. There is worry, frustration, difficulty, trouble. Look at that, one of the best parts of life. Another big blessing in my life is my marriage. Thank goodness, and all of you who are married know that there's no struggle in marriage, right? Come on. It's one of the biggest blessings, and yet one of the, potentially biggest sources of struggle and heartache and difficulty and frustration. It's not easy, and so I don't think I have to convince anyone here that there's a struggle. It's interesting the way the Apostle Paul talks about this struggle. He says, actually, our perception is that the struggle is about one thing, but it's not. He says we perceive that it's something, but actually it's something else. Look at what he says. He says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Now, I would be willing to guess that most of us, that's what we assume. We assume that the struggle and the difficulty we're facing in life is actually something that exists in the physical realm or the physical plane. And in fact, maybe I shouldn't talk about everyone else here, but at least I'm all the time tempted to think, you know what? If I just had some more money, this struggle would be over. Which, by the way, is not true. I know people with more money, and they have a struggle going on too. I'd like to think that if I had a bigger TV and it was flatter, my struggle would be easier. Or if I had a nicer car, right? I think all the time we're tempted to think, well, the problem is just my physical circumstances, and if they changed, right? In fact, I would be willing to guess that some of us, we look at the physical circumstances of the world around us and we think things like this: if I could just get control of them. Or maybe even sometimes we'll do this: we think to ourselves, if someone would just pluck us up out of these circumstances and put us over here in these, the struggle would be over. Which, by the way, is not true. But how much energy do we spend sometimes looking at the lives that other people lead, and we're jealous? And we think, man, look at the trouble I'm having. Look at the anxieties. And you know what? I'm way more talented and work way harder than that person, and yet it's so much easier for them. And if someone would just pick me up from these set of circumstances and put me down here, the struggle would be over. We think that the struggle is all about just this physical, material plane, the circumstances in our life. The Apostle Paul says that's our perception, but it's not true. Some of us were convinced that it's flesh and blood, that if we just looked differently, or if we had different physical traits or talents, that the struggle would be over. Again, not true. Paul says it's our perception. And by the way, it's a perception that our world wants to reinforce all the time. The world is just shouting at us that our struggle is basically on this level of flesh and blood, material, physical plane. Paul says it's not true. Although that's what we perceive, actually our struggle is spiritual. It's against rulers and authorities and powers in the spiritual realm, Paul says. So he says, although we normally see and perceive it to be one way, he says, actually our struggle, it's different. And I just want to mention that as a way of getting into what we're about to read, because what we're about to read has to do with what we see. And my hope today is that our eyes will be opened to something as we go along. Let's start in chapter 22, verse 1. Numbers 22, verse 1. It says, Then the Israelites traveled to the plains of Moab and camped along the Jordan across from Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian, This horde is going to lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. So Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at the time, sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Pethor near the river in his native land. And Balak said, A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people because they're too powerful for me. Perhaps then I'll be able to defeat them and drive them out of the country. For I know those you bless are blessed, and those you curse are cursed. There's two main characters in the story. There's Balak, who is a king of a people called the Moabites, and he sends a message to this spiritualistic person called Balaam, who supposedly has some spiritual powers to pronounce blessings and curses that stick. Now, there's a few details here that I want to spend a bunch of time orienting ourselves to, just so we can understand what's going on here. And if you look with me at verse 2, it says, Now Balak, son of Zippor, who happened to be the king of Moab, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Let's do this. Last week, if you were here, I put a picture on the screen that looked like this. You'll remember, if you were here last week, that the book of Numbers is basically a book about being in the wilderness. And we identified the wilderness. We said it's this place between Egypt, which is that green-looking triangle place on the left, and this land flowing with milk and honey, Israel, that they were going into. But for 40 years, they wandered around in that center triangle portion, a desert where there was no food and no water, and You remember God had this message for them. It was a simple message, which he repeats again and again and again and again, as long as they're in the wilderness, and this is what it is: trust me. Right? You can trust me. That's God's message to these people. So he has them live there 40 years in a place where it would be impossible for them to exist on their own, to show them that if God's with them, he's going to take care of them, and there's nothing that's going to happen, and they can trust him. Okay, as you read through the Bible, there's a whole bunch of people groups that I like to call the ites, right? You've run into these ites before: the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Hittites, the Edomites, right? You read the Bible, you find all these ites. And for the most part, you can just read past those and not get too involved. This time, you've got to have a little orientation. So here's a picture of basically where Israel traveled. They went from Egypt down into the desert. That circle sort of indicates they circled around. And then they ended up having to go around some people groups up to the right and over the top of the Dead Sea. Here is kind of the end of the journey, because when we get to chapters 22 through 24, 40 years have passed. They're at the end of the journey. They're about to enter into the land. And there are some people groups they have to pass by. So if you look at this map, it kind of shows where some of these people groups lived. At the very south there, they had to travel around the right-hand side to the east of them, were a group of people known as the Edomites. The Edomites were descendants of Esau. You remember there was Jacob and Esau. They were brothers of each other. The Edomites inhabited that territory right there. Just to their north were two people groups: the Moabites, which you see in blue, and the Ammonites, which you see in that yellowish area there. Moab and Ammon were two sons of Lot. Okay? And then just to the north and west of the Ammonites was a group of people known as the Amorites. Here's what you need to know, and you can see it here in verse 2. Balak, who is the king of the Moabites, right there in the blue, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Can you locate the Amorites there? Something had happened. And you need to know what it is that happened so that you can see what we're about to see. So look with me back at chapter 21, and we won't take time to read everything, but the passage right before this passage, you see probably a title just before verse 21, The Defeat of Sihon and Og. And if you were to read through this, it kind of just states things in some very unremarkable ways. And yet I want you to see that there's actually something very remarkable about this passage. And because of time, we won't take time to read everything here, but I want you to see how it's written: the defeat of King Og, who was the king of one of the Amorite clans. Look with me at verse 33 of chapter 21. It says, Then they, that's the Israelites, turned and went up along the road toward Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, and his whole army marched out to meet them in the battle of Edrei. The Lord said to Moses, Do not be afraid of him, for I have handed him over to you and his whole army and his land. Do to him what you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon. So they struck him down, together with his sons and his whole army, leaving them no survivors, and they took possession of his land. Now, if you're just reading along, you may think, okay, nothing too remarkable there. Actually, there's something amazing about this story. How many of you remember why it was the Israelites wandered around in the desert for 40 years? Do you remember this story? We talked about it last week, chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Numbers. They'd come up out of Egypt. They'd gotten into the wilderness. They went to Mount Sinai, and then they were going to march straight north into this land flowing with milk and honey. But before they did, they sent 12 spies to kind of spy out the land, see its territories, see how things were. And the spies checked everything out, and it was great. They came back, they said, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. They actually had brought back grapes from a vine, and that it was so heavy, this cluster of grapes, that 2 men had to carry it. They said, this is a fantastic place God's bringing us to. But do you remember what they said? They said, but we can't go up there. You remember why? There are giants in the land. Okay, maybe you've never heard of Og before, but let me introduce you to him. Actually, this isn't the only place in the Bible that the Bible speaks of him. He was actually, in the day, a very famous, legendary person. In fact, after he died, there were probably museums that were set up in his honor that even the Bible mentions. I'm going to put a verse on the screen from the book of Deuteronomy so that you can see a little bit more about him. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 3. It says this, Only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Raphaites. Okay, there's one more of the ites. here's what you need to know about the Raphaites. They were famous for being giants. And the Bible says he was the only one left. And then look what it says. His bed was made of iron and was more than 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. What kind of bed is that? I mean, how heavy and tall was this guy that he needed to be made of iron and be that big? And look what it says. Even though he's dead, it is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. Apparently, they kept it there as a museum piece. Like, there was this guy, Og. He was a giant. All right, I don't know if you can picture what he might have looked like. Let me help. I'm going to put a picture here on the screen. This picture is of the world's tallest man in our modern contemporary history. Ready for this? So this is in the last 100 years. Here you go. This is the world's tallest man. He stands about 9 feet tall, and just to give you some perspective, he's standing next to his father. He's about 22 years old. In this picture here, his father is the same height as me, about 6 feet tall. Okay, apparently when he took this picture, he weighed about 440 pounds. Okay, so this is the tallest man in our history. Think he needed a 13-foot bed? How tall was Og? Was he 9, 10, 11 feet? 12 feet? How heavy was he? Now let's talk about something. Let's talk about combat. So today, we have things like guns, rocket-propelled grenades. When we go to war, we can keep our distance from the people we're fighting. Not so in that day. When you went to fight someone, it was hand to hand. Sure, maybe you had a sword, maybe you were given a club, but it was hand to hand. I don't know if you can picture Og, but any volunteers, right? Which sometimes, we kind of laugh at the Israelites, come on, God was on their side. Why were they so afraid? Why were they afraid of giants? I mean, it makes sense, right? Anyone here want to do hand-to-hand combat with a guy like that? I mean, just picture this guy all ripped out and, okay, so they were scared. And so when there was a report from the spies, there are giants in the land, they freaked out and they said, we can't go up there. We could never win. Why? Because they were concentrated on just this physical realm. They hadn't learned this lesson yet. You can trust God. What's remarkable about this story is they go there and God says, listen, don't be afraid of him, for I've handed him over to you with his whole army and his land. And then there's just a simple statement, so they struck him down, and they inhabited his land. Now, what's remarkable, 40 years ago, they hadn't learned this lesson, you could trust God. Now, they'd gotten to this point where they realized you can't just concentrate on kind of the physical realm. There is also another factor in the spiritual realm, and it's God, and we can trust him. At any rate, all right, back to chapter 22, there's this fellow Balak, and he sees it, right? He sees wait a second, this army of Israelites, they have something that defies the physical realm. They went up there and just struck down these Amorites, and it says here in verse 3, they were terrified. And so here's what Balak does. He says, I've got to do something to strike them in the spiritual realm. And so he hires this man Balaam, and actually we don't know very much about Balaam. We don't know very much about him at all. Other than this, apparently in the time, he was famous for not only being able to see into the spiritual world, but in some way or another being able to manipulate it. Because this is a message. I want to just read it again in the middle of verse 5 that Balak sent to Balaam. And Balaam, by the way, he was from this place called Pethor near the river, which is probably in modern-day Iraq, so he was a long way away. He was probably this world-famous spiritualistic guy who was well-known to be able to do things in the spiritual realm. This is the message that they sent from Moab. A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people because they're too powerful for me. Perhaps then, if you curse them, I'll be able to defeat them and drive them out of the country. And look at what they say. For I know that those you bless are blessed, and those you curse are cursed. In other words, this Balaam had a reputation for being able to manipulate and change what happens in the spiritual world and cause it to stick. Balaam, we know you bless someone, they're blessed. We know you curse someone, they're cursed. So come and curse my enemy so that I won't be defeated. That's the basic message. Now, we won't take time to read everything. Balaam at first won't go. He's scared to go, but finally does consent. And I want you to come down with me to verse 21. And let me say this. There is this incident that happens between Balaam and his donkey, which not only is hilarious, the Bible is full of humor, but becomes like a microcosm for this larger story of what happens between Balak and Balaam as Balaam tries to curse the Israelites. So if you will, read along with me beginning in verse 21. Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab. Let me stop there. I want you to have the right thing in your mind. So I want you to picture that this is, a scene in a movie. And, it slows down to slow motion. He gets up early in the morning. He's like this hero who's going to come and take on the Israelites. He straps his sword. There's epic music playing in the background, dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. There's these two princes. They're riding off into the sunset. That's the initial picture you should have, and that'll set the stage for the humor that's going to result. It says this in verse 22, but God was very angry when he went. And the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Then it says this, Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, she turned off the road into a field. Balaam beat her to get her back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between two vineyards with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it, so he beat her again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam, and he was angry and beat her with his staff. Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" And Balaam answered the donkey, "You made a fool of me. If I had a sword in my hand, I'd kill you right now." The donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your own donkey, which you've always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" "No," he said. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. 2 quick things. One, the key word in this passage has to do with the idea of seeing. That verb is used again and again and again, what someone sees, and it's used to set up the humor of this passage. And if you can kind of picture this, here's Balaam, the world-famous seer into the spiritual realm, who's totally blind. And he's blind to what even a donkey, and you assert whatever other word you want to there, what even a donkey, I can't say it in church, can see. Okay? He is some kind of worldwide famous seer into the spiritual realm, and he can't see what even his donkey can see. And there's 1, 2, 3 times where the donkey sees something he can't. So he's riding off into the sunset down the road, and the donkey sees the angel, he does not. And when the donkey sees this angel standing in the way to oppose him, the donkey turns away and goes off into a field. And Balaam gets so upset, and you've just got to see the scene in the movie now. He gets down off his donkey and he just starts beating his, "You stupid donkey!" Right? And the donkey's finally like, "All right, let's get up." And they start riding again. And the donkey still sees the angel, and they're in this narrow place, and the donkey's scared. Balaam doesn't see anything. He's totally blind. The donkey starts squeezing him against one wall and crushes his foot. And so Balaam gets off the donkey again. It's like, "You stupid donkey!" Right? And then not once, not twice, but 3 times now, he gets back on the donkey, and this time the donkey is just like, "What do I do?" Because he sees the angel and Balaam doesn't. So in just resignation, just lays down. And Balaam one more time gets off the donkey and starts beating this donkey, at which point the donkey turns to "What are you doing? Don't you see it?" And Balaam's like, "Hey, I'd kill you right now." And the donkey's like, "Am I in the habit of doing this? Can't you see it? You've ridden me for all these years. Have I ever done this before? Open your eyes." And then finally these words, Verse 31, then the Lord, catch the word, opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. Up until this moment, it had been a hoax. I mean, he was world famous for being able to see into the spiritual world, but in truth, he couldn't even see what his donkey could see until God opened his eyes. And when he opened his eyes, see, Balaam, he was carrying on this ruse, right? That not only could he see into the spiritual world, but he could manipulate it and change it. That he had some kind of power over it. And when his eyes were finally opened to see the spiritual world as it really is, all they could do was bow to the ground and acknowledge this fact. God is in control. As much as we might like to manipulate the spiritual world or think we have some kind of control over it, we don't. God is in control. Now, that's like a microcosm for the wider story. Here's what happens next, and we won't have time to read all of it, but I encourage you to just, as I said, you're going to go home and you're going to read these stories yourself anyway. Here's what happens next. Balaam at first is like, well, I should just go back. And God says, no, don't do that. Go ahead and go, but you're only going to say what I tell you to see now that your eyes are opened. And so he goes, and it's like a replay of what just happened between him and his donkey, only now Balak, the king, is the master, and he's like the donkey. Because what happens is Balak is like, oh, I'm so glad you're here. Now let's go get this done. And so they kind of walk up into a high place, and they look down at Israel, and Balak's like, okay, go ahead and curse him now. And Balaam opens his mouth, and instead of cursing him, he blesses him. And this is actually going to happen 3 times, just like it happened with the donkey, where Balak's like, okay, curse him. And instead of cursing, he blesses him. He acknowledges the spiritual reality the way it really is. But let's just read the first blessing. You find it in chapter 23, beginning in verse 7. Balaam uttered his oracle, and this is what he says. Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab from the eastern mountains. Come, he said, curse Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? From the rocky peaks I see them. From the heights I view them. I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob or number the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous. May my end be like theirs. And then Balak says to him, what have you done to me? It's like, you stupid Balaam, right? I brought you here to curse them. What have you done? You've done nothing but bless them, he says. And then Balaam answers, he says, must I not speak what the Lord puts in my mouth? So Balak is still like, you've got to manipulate this situation. You've got to change the spiritual reality that's at play here. And Balaam's like, I can't. And that happens not once, but twice, and then 3 times. And let's see if we can just kind of, as we go along here, summarize what it is that we're seeing or learning. First, we're saying that beyond the physical realm, there's a spiritual realm. And that's what the Israelites came to learn. They came to learn in the desert. Like, look, beyond this desert and the difficulties and dangers of the desert, or beyond the giants, they've learned that they can look beyond the giants to see a giant God, right? There's a spiritual realm that goes beyond just what's physical. The second thing that I think we've learned is this. In that spiritual realm, God's in control. If he intends to bless people, they're blessed. If he intends to curse people, they're cursed. There's nothing we can do to change it. There's no way we can manipulate it. Balaam came face to face with that reality, and he just bowed down to the ground and acknowledged and surrendered to this idea that in the spiritual realm, God is in control. There's nothing we can do ourselves. There's a third thing, and I want to just go a little deeper because the story actually goes a little deeper, and I want you to see this next thing because it's the key. I hope that today your eyes get open to this and you can see it too. Because here's what happened. The story of Balak and Balaam mirrors what happened with Balaam and his donkey. 3 times he's supposed to do something, but he does the opposite. 3 times he's supposed to curse, but he actually blesses. And at the end of it, Balak just says to him, like, look, just go. Just get out of here. You've done no good at all. And then Balaam does something. He opens his mouth to speak one more time. And I want you to see what it is he said. So look with me in chapter 24, beginning at verse 15. After Balak said, "Why don't you just get out of here," after the third time, these are the words that Balaam spoke out loud. It says in verse 15, "Then he uttered his oracle, the oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of one whose eye sees clearly, the oracle of one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate, and whose eyes are opened." Do you see all the emphasis on eyes being open to reality? And he says, okay, I'm speaking now as one who sees the truth as it actually is, who has come face to face with God and peered into the spiritual reality, and I understand it. And then he says this, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the sons of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city." Before I say too many things about this, let me just say this fact. Interestingly enough, besides the New Testament, this is the one place in the Bible where someone is called a magi. And Balaam is called a magi from the east. Now, let me see if I can summarize the story as we have it so far. A wicked king, Balak, sought to use foreign magi, Balaam, to destroy his enemy. But the magi actually honored his enemy and thwarted the king's plan. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the New Testament, does that sound familiar at all? Do you see something? Here's how I'd like to characterize this passage in the Old Testament. It's like God, for those who had eyes to see, was laying down a trail of breadcrumbs. Just follow this trail of breadcrumbs to see what it is I want you to see. And here's how the story of Jesus' birth goes after Jesus was born. There were magi from the east who came. They followed a star and they arrived in Jerusalem where they met a king, an evil, wicked king. His name was Herod. And Herod devised this plan where he thought he could use the magi to destroy this child. And so he devised this plan and he said, "Why don't you go and find them and worship them, and then come and report to me where he is, and I'll go worship him too." Like Dr. Evil, wink, wink, right? Because he actually had in mind he was going to go and kill Jesus. But the Magi, who get wise to Herod's plan, they don't go back and report after they go and worship Jesus. They just leave another way, and Jesus is spared. Does this story sound familiar? A wicked king sought to use foreign Magi to destroy his enemy, but the Magi actually honored his enemy and thwarted the king's plan. Now here's the deal. Do you remember what it is the Magi followed? Let me read this one more time. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not yet. A star will rise out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. A ruler will come from Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city." Maybe you remember this. The Magi showed up in Jerusalem. They said, we saw the star in the east, and so we came to worship the king. Remember that? Why were they looking for a star? It's because one of their ancestors, Balaam, had said, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not yet. But one day, keep watch, there's going to be a star. And when it rises, he's the king." And so when those magi from the east saw that star, they remembered what their ancestor had said, and so they went and saw after him. It's like there's this trail of breadcrumbs leading somewhere. Let's see if we can just summarize. It's not all physical. Our struggles in the spiritual realm. When you talk about the spiritual realm, there's nothing we can do to manipulate the situation. God is totally in charge. And in that spiritual realm, God's led us clues to lead us all the way to Jesus. Here's the reason why. Because although we might think our struggle is physical, the truth of the matter is it's spiritual. It's that we're cut off from God by sin. And there is absolutely nothing we can do. It doesn't matter how religious we become. It doesn't matter how much we try. We can't manipulate the situation to get ourselves back to God. We're just stuck. And what we couldn't do for ourselves, God did for us by sending his son Jesus to be born in human flesh, so that at the cross, he could take all our sin, all our guilt, all our shame, the source of all our struggles, and put it on Jesus and punish Jesus and take care of those things once for all. Do you see it? I mean, can you peer past just the everyday physical reality where we think, you know what, I need more money. You don't need more money. You don't need a bigger TV that's more flat. You don't need to change your looks, your appearance, your physical circumstances. You don't need what someone else has. Do you see it? And if today, for whatever reasons, because God's given you eyes to see, you've peered into spiritual reality and you say, that is the answer. God's been trying to tell me all along that's the answer, and why not today do exactly what Balaam did? When he came face to face with a God that was totally in charge, he just bowed down to the ground. He said, okay, I'm not God. You're God. And he looked forward and pointed out where the real answer would be, right here in Jesus Christ. Can you see it?